People who lived in 70s, 80s, 90s, what was it really like? A ton of people smoked cigarettes and they smoked them damn near everywhere. Non-smoking sections in restaurants were frequently just a different section when the whole place would be smoke-filled. Edit. I commented about this recently. So pasting from a prior comment to add. I loved how corner grocery stores and many other businesses would have at least one arcade machine. Walking into a store to either hear someone playing or hearing the game's demo provided a fun atmosphere that's largely gone these days. Payphones were all over the place. It was awesome when I was like 16 with a pager. I could just say I couldn't find a payphone when my parents were looking for me. Coordinating with people was much more difficult. Of course. Like someone would be really late for something, holding everyone up, and no one had a clue what was going on. A lot of time was spent waiting for things. I first got my hands on the NES shortly after its release. And living through that age in gaming was so awesome. My friends and I had a meeting place where if they needed my help in a game they'd be there at a certain time. There was a lot of that. Like if you went to a concert with someone, it was important to designate a meeting place if you get split up. The release of new media like songs or movies was so much more exciting. As options were more limited, you either went to the movies or you had a handful of channels on TV. But visiting rental places was fun. Late at night, basically nothing but infomercials would be on. The old school light bulbs emitted a fair amount of heat. If you went to a theater performance, there'd be this huge furnace-like bulb to light the stage, making everyone sweat. And just my experience, but if you walked past a person you'd generally say hi. Perhaps because it felt awkward not to acknowledge their presence. Not having anything else to occupy your attention. I remember the shift when phones tech made us start looking down, not at each other. It really was a different world back then. I grew up in horse country in New Jersey in the 70s. We had 13 acres of fields and barns, a big farmhouse, tractors, go-karts, mini bikes and snowmobiles. My sister had a pickup truck at age 15 that always had a bale of hay in the back because then it qualified as a farm truck, and she was allowed to drive it. Two of my neighbors' friends were on cow farms. One was raising beef. One was a milk farm. We rarely contacted in any way other than visiting. If you wanted to see what your friend was doing, you hopped on your minibike, ATV or whatever and rode over there. CB radios were the only real, long-range, communication stuff other than phone. When I was old enough, I bolted an antenna to the top of the house and have great memories of talking with my friend, 2 miles away, while we were watching the same TV show. That was exciting. The 80s were wild and exciting. Technology was kicking it, still pre-internet, but BBSs were the way to live and die. Logging in to see what people have said online in the last N days was nifty. I ran a BBS on an Apple II clone that had a group of 25 or so localish people. Long-distance charges were a thing. And every once in a while we'd have a party and everyone would meet in person. That was crazy. I went to a lot of rock concerts. A short list. Yes. I really saw all of these acts live. Pink Floyd, Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Jethro Tull, Moody Blues, Boston, Bon Jovi, Grateful Dead, My First, Genesis, Billy Joel, Talking Heads. Printed catalogs were absolute king. Computer Shopper was a catalog that was hundreds of pages thick and was the equivalent of browsing eBay in print form. You could find just about anything in there. Compared to today, the biggest change is not having all the world's knowledge at your fingertips. You could argue for hours about whether the little kid says, "Look, Mummy, there's no plane up in the sky," and have a dozen opinions. And there was no way to tell unless someone had the album, tape, whatever, and then you'd still argue. Rand McNally road atlases were fun as hell. I have in my hand a map of all the roads in the US. We can go anywhere. Quote. It was quiet. I don't want to sound like a boomer, but it was really, really quiet. People spent more time just being outdoors, and reading, and sitting around not doing much. You couldn't just dial up whatever you wanted on a streaming service. If you wanted to learning something, you had to go a library. There were even people at the library who were sort of human Google. You'd ask them a question and they'd go and find the answer. Correspondence was slower. You mailed things physically. You had to keep track of things like bank accounts and bills manually, with pencil and paper, because you couldn't just look up your balance. Parents weren't around as much. Kids came home from school and made themselves a snack, then got on their bikes and left. It's more, be home by dinner, and just, trust your kids would come back home. The world was smaller too. You knew about your town, your friends, maybe your family if they were close, and that was about it. You certainly didn't know what a celebrity was eating or what a guy in China was walking around doing all day. Jesus Christ, I have become a historical reference. I was born in '84, so I don't remember much of the '80s but remember all of the '90s. It felt like a simpler time. You actually had to wait for things. You couldn't just buy whatever from Amazon. I remember my parents had an actual checkbook with a register that they recorded their transactions in. As an adult, I don't know how they did it. By the time I had my own bank account, I could view everything online. In my neighborhood, we still had a little corner store where you could buy penny candy. Everything seemed really peaceful. I had a great childhood in the '90s. I was 9 years old in '89, so the '90s encapsulated my entire teen years. It was great. It had an easy, stress-free feel to it. The music culture was still very alive, and we had some great music. We didn't have cell phones or social media, so I could leave the house and no one would know where I was unless I wanted them to. Thank God I didn't have a cell phone. I got in enough trouble with a disposable camera. Can only imagine how that would have gone with a cell phone and social media. I had a pager. I thought I was so cool. My pager message included the word, "What up?" Quote, "'Cause you know, I was cool." The only pressure I had to conform to beauty standards came from 17 magazine and Cosmopolitan, not Instagram. The '90s was a gem and most of us didn't realize it while we were in it. That being said, enjoy your decades. Who knows which one will be the next '90s, and you'll miss it too if you're not paying attention. I grew up in a poor province of a third world country. The '90s in my village was not fun. My family lived below the poverty line, just like more than half of the country population. We were not starving, but having to skip a meal was not rare, and meat was a luxury. My village did not have running water, so it was my job to carry water from the well back home. We shared a toilet for the whole commune, which is just a hole on the ground. Fun fact, I did not live in a house with modern toilet until I was already a man. We had electricity for 2 or 3 hours per day if we were lucky. So of course no one had appliances like AC, washing machine, or fridge. Most house only had a few light bulbs, a fan or two and a radio. One house had a 14 inches black and white TV. They were the star. We would gather at their house to watch the news every evening. We generally had electricity around 7 p.m. 9 p.m. Traveling was a huge pain. The best most of us can afford was a bicycle. If you own a bike then you are rich. And car was a myth for us children. Some of my relatives move away, and it was hard to visit each other. But at least it was still better than the '80s or '70s. I did not experience those times personally, but we had a war that killed millions of our countrymen. Then embargo, hunger, and social unrest. I'm grateful that things improved so much throughout the last 3 decades. My children can now live a life that me or my parents didn't even dare to dream of back then. After SNL was over at midnight, Monty Python was on PBS. There was nothing worthwhile to keep my brother and me up after that. So there was no reason to stay up past 12:30. There was a certain sense of optimism. In the 90s, at least I was only a child. But even then I could feel a general consensus amongst people that things were okay, mellow, maybe. Not to mention, there was a prevailing excitement that we were building up to an entirely new millennium. So I think everyone had this hope that good things were waiting behind that door. The end of war, the end of poverty, sickness, what have you. The 20th century had been hell. 2 world wars, Vietnam, a Cold War. People were ready to see something better. And for a brief while, we did. Then 9/11 happened and it all went belly up. Born in the 80s, but grew up in the 90s. A lot more smoking. Every high school had some spot, the dumpsters, the visitor bleachers, the one tree out back where kids smoked. The last few rows on airplanes were reserved for smokers and were covered in a thick haze you had to go through if you wanted to use the bathroom. Cars had ashtrays built into the arm rests that I got yelled at for flipping open and closed when I got bored. Info gathering was more diverse. If you wanted a pizza, you had to get the phone book and call. To see a movie, check the newspaper for theater showings. For research, go to the library. All that can be done on a phone now. Born in 1980. As a small kid in the 80s, I remember how exciting cartoons, action figures, and movies were, which I guess is pretty typical for kids. I literally had a kid's record player and got a cassette radio one year, which was very cool. The world as a whole seemed larger, and distances seemed greater. In the 90s, I remember the increasing use of computers. But even when I graduated high school in '98, a lot of people didn't even have computers in their homes. Some did, but it wasn't ubiquitous. As far as pop culture, most of it was still driven by cable TV, radio, video stores, theaters, and magazines. The sense of culture was more universal since there weren't as many avenues available as there are now. Finding rare movies, shows, music was harder because it had to be a physical copy you shared, which made finding it more exciting. Socially, there was less of a feeling of FOMO, because we weren't constantly online and social media didn't exist. So whatever you were doing at the time with whoever you were with was what you were focused on. Cell phones were still pretty rare in the 90s. The most people often had was a pager. Long-distance phone calls were still expensive. Politically, things really took a turn after 9/11 and we lost a lot of optimism that was present in the 90s. Looking back at the poor choices our leaders made during the 80s makes me understand the fallout we're experiencing now. Culturally, there was much less representation of diversity in the 80s and 90s. And unfortunately, a good amount of that representation was still based in stereotypes and caricatures. Overall, I'm glad to be living in the present, as complicated as it is. The music was excellent. The food options were what your mom cooked. Or not. If you mom wanted, or cared, to know where you were, she just looked down the street to see which yard all the bikes were in. You know you were allowed back in the house only when the streetlight came on. I said, light, because my mother had to buy a streetlight to put in our backyard. There were no lights on our street. If you traveled overnight, the kids slept in the back. The oldest kid got the back seat. The middle got the floorboard and the youngest, me, got to sleep in the back dash. You collected the green bottle Coca-Cola bottles. The big ones were worth 10 cents and the small ones were worth 5. So 2 big and 1 small would get you a quarter, which was enough for another Coke and a candy bar. When we were thirsty, we drank out of the hose. Let it cool down first. If you hear a snippet of a song, say heard a bit on the AM radio while way out of broadcast range, you had to remember the song and hope someone could recognize it when you described it. Took me 4 years to find one. If you wanted to make a mixtape, you clicked record on a handheld recorder in front of the speaker and prayed that the DJ didn't speak over the intro. We played all day long without parental supervision. We biked for miles. At 12, I walked down the road with a .22 and my friend with a 12 gauge, and the only thing any adult said to us was, "Be careful." We walked or biked everywhere. You got a new bike every Christmas and it was usually torn down and rebuilt by February. We had to know how to change our own chains, change our own bearings and balance our own wheels, just to name a few. And the bonus, there is no video evidence of the stupid things we did. I was a high schooler from 9498. There was an innocence in the 90s we don't have anymore. We were a bit more naive. It was assumed everything was getting progressively better. That era ended on 9/11 and it still makes me sad thinking about what we lost. Gen X guy here, and from my experience it was a beautiful time to grow up. I grew up on coast in SoCal. Lots of freedom and no internet to distract you. We were always outside playing football in street or hitting baseballs at park or skateboarding all over the place with no cell phones for parents to constantly track us. This forced us to be self-reliant. In summer we ride our bikes to beach and ride waves all day. Listen to music on our radios which everyone would hear, not just individually on AirPods isolated in your own world, etc. I miss those days, and as a father of middle schoolers I wish they could have experienced it. The cell phone and internet was a nuclear bomb that screwed up the way kids grow up. Just my opinion. 90s were absolutely incredible to me, and maybe I'm just biased because I lived it. It was one of the best eras in recent human history. Everything was changing, but you could feel we were all in it together. Technology, film, TV, toys, games, fashion and pop culture were all so innovative and cool. It all felt interconnected, like one thing affected another thing. I would say it lasted until about 2003 or 2004. Just about the time when the smartphones were coming out. You could literally feel it dying. It was hard. Still is when I think about it. You didn't have this constant buzzing of social media in your ear telling that if your friends didn't agree with you 100% of the time, they are toxic and that you should leave them. And that in returns leaves you feeling lonely because no one is going to agree with you 100% of the time. Instead, your friend group was usually made up of a bunch of different people with different opinions that you could get into fights with, but you would make up later on as you worked your issues out between you. Everyone went through this. So, the idea of being sad and feeling lonely because your friendships weren't this fantasy of perfection did not exist. 90s was my childhood. 2000s was my teenage years. The Cranberries was my fave band. Kurt Cobain's death was all over the news. River Phoenix. Then late 90s. Britney versus Christina. Backstreet versus NSYNC. Dial-up modem. No Google. Our parents bought us encyclopedias. Fun days. Edit. The theme song of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Captain Planet, and Power Rangers. The intro of X-Men. 1999. People were paranoid of the millennium bug. There was a troll who started calling it a centennial bug. Open mouth smile. Spice Girls. My older sisters and cousins were reminiscing about the new kids on the block because of the Backstreet Boys. Everyone has a cassette tape of Boys II Men. Everyone was singing One Sweet Day, Gangsta's Paradise. Was the most memorized first stanza. Some teenagers thought they're cool if they talk about Tupac, Shakur and Biggie. Open Mouth Smile, Dose, Windows 95. Burning CDs was a legit side hustle. The kid who has the latest Nintendo family computer is the coolest. Our computer teacher tried to teach us Microsoft Access, but she also had no clue about it. Things got appreciably better after the USSR fell. There used to be armed bombers flying around the clock, ready to attack. And I remember when they landed and didn't go back up. It was almost like there was a real sense of relief when the wall fell. There was hope, you know? If you were picking someone up from the airport, you could go right to their gate and meet them there. I was 12 in 1979 and disco was coming to an end. We used to go this local dance thing every Saturday afternoon. I got to see what life as a preteen was all about. There was a lot of similar things that people do today. Little League, ballet, but the Atari 2600 and cable TV, VCRS sort or got us back inside. I remember parents having us go outside for a play break and then back to asteroids. 80s was more of a preppy mall culture. MTV was massive. We worried about Russia and AIDS. I met my girlfriend in 1984. We watched Live Aid. We've been married for 33 years. The 90s were tricky because I was drunk for a while, got sober in 1996, and had 2 kids just as grunge was going away. I like ECW and Tower Records. 1999 ended with us all worrying if the world was going to glitch out. It didn't.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epic Aircast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.